I do want to mention that we are in the process of doing our strategic plan. This is the guiding principles for our department that is going to direct our work for the next 10 years. And I would encourage all of you to participate in that. We have another survey there. It's at rain2riveratx.com. And one of the reasons I bring that up is when we were looking through the comments that we got on the survey, a lot of them were larger in scope than just this project. And we think a lot of that feedback would be really great to provide also to the rain2riveratx.com. So I would encourage you to please, participate in that survey. We have shared all your comments with them already. So as far as introductions are concerned, there are, actually 3 or 4 people that I wanted to introduce you tonight. So first is David Trujillo, who is an engineer with our department. He's been working on this project for a long time now, and he's going to be taking you through the presentation. I also want to mention Marie Lancaster. She's actually not with us tonight, but she's also been working really hard on this project. But we also have Danielle Guevara, who is going to be helping us with the chat when we get to the question and answer session. So that is Danielle. And then I also wanted to introduce Ken Craig, who is here with Councilmember Kitchen's office. Ken, if you want to say hello.
Hello, everybody. Thank you all, both staff and the residents, for being here. And I'm just amazed by all the work that Watershed does, and we're just really appreciative. The council member would have been here, but we had multiple events we had to attend tonight. We did rock, paper, scissors, and I won.
Well, we're glad you're here tonight. With that, I will turn it over to David.
Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight with us. So I'm going to kind of give you a brief overview of what I'm going to be discussing today. I'm going to have three main objectives. First, I want to talk about the project area in general, kind of give a little bit of background on the area and the efforts that we've done so far. Then we'll talk about the results that we've received from the survey that we conducted earlier this year. And we'll talk about next steps. And we'll appreciate if you could please hold your questions until the end, and that way we can get through a presentation and address anybody's concerns. First, I want to show you this map. This is the area Stephanie mentioned for the project area. It's roughly between Westgate and Congress. There's been a history of flooding here recently, in 1998 and 2001. Roughly around that time, the city started working with others like the Corps of Engineers and the Travis County and LCRA to try to find solutions for flooding in this area. So that kind of culminated with a report in the mid-2000s, around 2006, that recommended some improvements or modifications to the channel which would reduce flood risk in the area. However, the scope of those modifications was something that residents and the city didn't feel was something that could be implemented. So in the end, it was not considered feasible at that time. However, because of the high risk of flooding, there was a recommendation to proceed with buyouts in the westernmost part of the project area, Peyton Loop area. So there were 25 buyouts that were done between 2010 and 2011. Unfortunately, 2 years later, in 2013, in October, there was another significant flood event. Several homes were damaged, and others were flooded. Council approved the acquisition of some of those homes that were damaged. And then, in addition to that, we offered what was known as phase 1 of the flood risk reduction project, which consisted in buyouts of 52 properties, and those took place between 2015 and 2019. And those are mainly in the Harwood and Radham areas. Up to this point, that's the work that has been done. But we recognize that there's still a lot of properties at risk of flooding in this area. So that's why we launched this phase 2 study to try to understand the flood risk and find solutions. There's 3 main things that we want to accomplish with this feasibility. First one was understand what the current flood risk is, understanding how many properties are at risk of flooding, also evaluating again some of those alternatives that have been previously proposed, as well as new ones, just to see what may be feasible in this area. So the first thing that I mentioned there was updating the flood risk. The reason for that is, some of you may be familiar with this, but in in recent years, the National Weather Service issued new precipitation data known as Atlas 14. Basically, the National Weather Service acquired more data through the recent years, because I believe that the latest precipitation data was based on information up to the 1970s. So with more data and more gauges, they were able to get a better understanding of how much it actually rains and the frequency in the city. Based on that, we've come to learn that a lot of the floodplains in the city will likely be expanding in the coming years. That's something separate from this project. That's something that will happen through the regular mapping process, and that's, like I said, separate from this project. However, since we already have that information, we wanted to use that to develop a map of the current flood risk for this area, and that's what you see here. So that outline that you see in red, that's what you may be familiar with, the FEMA floodplain, and that map or water, kind of showing water, that's the water project is saying that the actual risk is. So unfortunately, there's this area upstream or west of the railroad tracks where a lot more properties are actually at risk of flooding than we previously understood. And then also throughout the floodplain, even those that were already inside the 100-year floodplain, they may actually be at a higher risk than we previously believed. So there's other areas also along the boundaries and also along the harbor area that are actually a higher risk than we previously knew. So that was the first task of this study. Secondly, we obviously wanted to see what we could do about it. So we analyzed all sorts of different tools that we have at our disposal, typically for this type of areas. So first we started looking at the creek modification that had been proposed earlier. We looked at the possibility of flood walls in certain sections to prevent the creek from overflowing its banks. We looked at optional buyouts, the possibility of elevating residential structures. And then we looked at a couple of different upstream detention areas. One of them actually upstream of or west of the project area in the Sunset Valley area, and another one in the Westgate area. And then we also looked at potential new creek modifications that are different than those that were proposed in the 2000s. Finally, we also looked at a bypass tunnel, which would basically take some of that excellent flow during significant rain events. And we also looked at the possibility of combining some of those alternatives. So for different reasons, some of those alternatives are not technically feasible, meaning that they would not provide sufficient flood risk reduction, or that they would actually, in some cases, even basically more harm than good. So for example, the previously analyzed channel modifications don't really make a lot of sense now because of the buyouts that we have done. Some of the homes that would be protected have already been acquired. Plus, it would require a very significant impact on the creek in order to reduce the flood risk. Flood walls sound like a good idea, but unfortunately, they would cause water levels to rise in locations that are currently not subject to flooding. So it would basically make things worse in certain areas. So that's something that we couldn't do. Then, as far as the regional detention, it showed that it wouldn't really provide the benefits to the residences. For the Westgate detention, we actually also looked at the possibility of elevating Westgate Boulevard. That would be positive in terms of preventing that street from flooding, but it didn't really provide benefit to the residences in the project area either. So what we're left of as feasible at this point are three alternatives, which is the optional buyouts, creek modifications, and bypass tunnel. And that's why those were the ones that we presented to you earlier this year. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of those, just to give you some context and some of the advantages and disadvantages of each one of those. So first one, I'm going to talk about the buyouts, optional buyouts. As the name implies, this is something that eligible homeowners would choose whether they want to participate or not. The advantage of this particular alternative is that for those homeowners that participate, their flood risk would be completely eliminated, obviously. Cost at this point, we have a very wide range from 20 to 250 million. The reason for that is because we don't know yet exactly which homes would be made eligible and which homeowners would choose to participate. Also, those costs were based on 2020 numbers before the pandemic. And we know that prices have increased significantly since then and continue to do so. So that's something that we would obviously take into consideration as we continue to analyze this alternative. One of the advantages is that this option actually has potentially the quickest timeline for implementation, with 2 to 5 years once funding is secured. And like I said, the eligibility would still need to be determined to know exactly which homes would be made eligible. I just wanted to show you some pictures and kind of narrate what the process would be for those homeowners that are eligible and choose to engage with us. So there will be an initial meeting. If the homeowner is interested, then the home would be appraised and to know what the value is. And basically, the city would offer fair market value. If the homeowner chooses to accept the offer, then once the city acquires the property, we would schedule it for demolition, and we would clear everything from the site, and the vegetation would be reestablished to a more natural state. And you may be familiar with this from some of the buyouts in your area. The second alternative that I want to talk about is the channel modifications or creek modifications. I guess I'll start with the next slide to kind of show you what I mean by that. So if you look at this line, the squiggly line here, that's what would be today the ground elevation. So pretend you're standing on that line and you're looking into the direction of flow that way. That's kind of what you would see with the existing ground elevation following that line. And then you see two horizontal lines at the top. That's the 25-year flood and the 100-year flood level. So that's what we would expect water to be at those elevations. Homes for this particular cross section may be just above where that first tree is. So some homes may be impacted by the 25-year or the 100-year flood event. So what we would try to do is if you look at that dashed line in the bottom, we would go down to the bottom of the channel and excavate a certain amount of dirt, which would provide more conveyance and storage for the water. And that would tend to make those horizontal lines for the 100-year storm and 25-year storm to come down. And that would take some of those homes out of the floodplain, basically. I have a map here, and that's from the feasibility study. Those areas with the hash lines, those are the ones that are being assessed for potential channel modifications. That's not final yet, but basically what that means is that it would not be a continuous modification of the whole channel, but just certain sections where it makes the most sense. And this would tend to increase the capacity of the channel and reduce flooding. So this is an effective solution. However, since we're also trying to minimize the impact on the creek, it would not be able to completely eliminate the risk or reduce the risk to every single home in the area. So it's an effective solution, but it has its limitations. It also has environmental impacts because we would have to obviously clear vegetation and excavate at the creek level. And there's a lot more work that needs to be done in the next phase of the study to kind of pinpoint the exact areas that we would be targeting and how much that would be. Cost, again, this is pre-pandemic estimates, so they will likely be higher. 60 to 100 million also depends on how much, which areas are targeted and what constraints would be present during construction. Timeline, it says 5 to 7 years once funding is secured. So it would take longer than the buyouts. And keep in mind that those timeline, of course, would be subject to any delays if there's any, for example, any significant environmental findings in the next phases. So here's some pictures to kind of explain what that would look like in real life. So you could expect to see machinery at the creek level, clearing vegetation and removing dirt, whatever those channel modifications are needed to be made. Once that's done, you can expect vegetation to be reestablished and have a more natural look in the end. So we would not be proposing like a concrete channel that would be just like totally artificial, but it'd be a compromise basically to make sure that it still resembles a natural state, but it would require that level of construction. And it would also require maintenance. At this point, I couldn't tell you the frequency or the scope, but there will likely be periodic maintenance to either remove sediment and also clear vegetation so that it's functioning as it should. That's something that we will look at in more detail in the next phase to know exactly what type of maintenance and what the frequency would be. So that's something that we will figure out in the next phases. Finally, the third alternative is the bypass tunnel. Different configurations were analyzed, but the one that we're discussing is basically starting at the Baton Loop area, going underneath Stasny Lane, discharging just east of Congress Avenue. That location was selected because our engineers determined that discharging there was one of the few locations where they could do so without causing adverse impacts downstream. So obviously we don't want to cause any damage downstream, such as, increase in water surface elevations or inundating any downstream structures. So that was an optimal location for discharge. The inlet, we could still modify that location, but at this point, this is the location that we're proposing. This tunnel would it would not be an open trench. We wouldn't just shut down Stasny for however many years it takes to build, but it's actually be using a boring machine. So it would be done underground with not too many impacts to Stasny Lane, so that there would be a need for bore pits and shafts for the equipment to access the construction. So something like you see here in the middle picture, where you have basically a large hole in the ground where the machines can access and material can be removed. You could expect maybe 3 or 4 such locations where there's changes in the direction of the tunnel. But for the most part, it kind of would resemble what you see on the pictures on either side, where it's just basically a large diameter, I believe it's 26-foot diameter tunnel that would be underground. So the objective, again, of this tunnel would be it wouldn't take all the water, but just once it reaches a certain level, water would fall into an inlet for this tunnel, and it would be diverted all the way down to the creek, bypassing basically the whole project area, and it would produce a lot of benefits in terms of flood risk reduction. Most of the structures, or all of the structures, actually are shown as receiving some sort of benefit, and a very good portion of them would be actually removed from the floodplain. So this one, of course, is a costly project. Pre-pandemic cost of $230 million, timeline 7 to 10 years, and of course, if there's any significant environmental findings, that could take even longer. So that kind of concludes the discussion of those 2 alternatives. Now I want to get into what we heard from you all, from the residents, as far as when you all weighed into what these different alternatives are. So we obviously wanted to inform the community of the work that we had done, and also take the input from the residents. So we mailed around 3,200 flyers to residents in the floodplain and immediate areas. We made posts on Facebook and Nextdoor. We have a project website, a video of the project, and all these actually we wanted to promote our survey. We received around 270 responses, including 77 open comments. And so now we're also doing the public meetings to kind of inform what we've learned so far and get additional feedback. Like I said, we had 77 open comments, and we obviously compiled everything and analyzed it, and I'm going to share some of the themes that we identified. So we noticed that around 31% of those comments dealt with residents' preferences between the different alternatives. We also got around 21% specifying what kind of outcomes residents wanted to see from this project. We also received a number of other miscellaneous and project-related concerns. As far as the preferences, the tunnel seemed to have more of a support in those comments as opposed to the creek modifications and buyouts. However, each one of those also received support, and they were about equal. As far as the desired outcomes, we see that the residents are really interested in environmental, preserving the natural habitat, having green space, things of that sort. And we also received comments about project concerns, dealing with some related to specific alternatives, some dealing with issues related to the floodplains. Some of those were because, as I explained, the residents that are not currently on the FEMA floodplain are shown to be at risk based on our project map. So that obviously created some confusion. As far as miscellaneous concerns, we received input related to some residents suggested other alternatives. Some of those I have already discussed. We did look at some of those, but we're not deemed feasible because they didn't provide sufficient flood risk reduction. Other residents talked about the need for quick cleanups and some issues with the survey itself. Now, getting into the actual questions of the survey, the first question that we asked was, we wanted to hear what people's experience with flooding in the area are or were. Over 50% were not aware that their home was at risk of flooding. Some of them may actually be outside of the floodplain, and some are just not aware that they live in the floodplain. 35% know or are aware of the risk of flooding, and 13% had actually experienced flooding in the past, either in their home or in their garage. So we wanted to know how people or residents felt about the need for a project in this area to help reduce the risk of flooding. And we found that residents overall think this is a very important thing. So overall, from all residents, basically 72% felt that it was either very important or absolutely essential, and only 4% felt that it was not important at all. We also kind of analyzed those that had flooded and see how they had responded. And you can see that almost 90%, so 88% felt that it was either very important or absolutely essential. And actually 0 of them responded that it was not important at all. So overall, we see a strong need for the project. And we also see that obviously those that have experienced flooding have even greater concerns about flooding. Another question that we asked was, we wanted to know what residents' concerns were about flooding or living in the floodplain. They were able to choose 3 of those. So the top 3 were the effect on property value, cost of repairs if there was flooding, and safety. But we also see a lot of other concerns that also have very high response rates. So what this tells us is that there's a lot of different residents have different concerns in mind, but only 6%, or only 12% felt that they were not concerned. So overwhelming majority of residents have a mix of concerns about flooding. So we wanted to know if residents had considered moving because of flooding in this area. Again, we analyzed the overall response and only those that have flooded. And we see that in general, despite risks, residents like this area and they have not considered moving. However, those that have flooded in the past are a little bit more likely to have considered moving than those that have not. We asked the question about doing a project to reduce flood risk in the area. What would be some of the main considerations that we should take into account? And here again, we see a mix of priorities. We have a lot of considerations that have about equal support, but we do see that environmental considerations raised to the top. So preserving the natural appearance of the creek was number 1. Obviously, residents also want to make sure that a significant number of homes are protected. And again, they want to avoid impact to wildlife. So we see a mix of priorities. And this is what obviously makes selecting a project challenging, because there's often competing priorities. So obviously a project that would benefit all residents while preserving, minimizing environmental impact. That's what we all want, but it's challenging. So that's something that we need to take into consideration as we move forward. The next question that we had was specific about the alternatives. So we went to ask which of the alternatives were something that would be acceptable to the residents. The tunnel received the most support. So 64% of respondents said that the tunnel would be acceptable. And then the buyouts and the creek modifications received about equal support, 48% each. And only 9% of the respondents said that none of the alternatives seemed acceptable to them. Again, we see a mix of support, with the tunnel having a slightly more support, and very few residents indicating that none of those would be acceptable. Both the channel modifications and the buyouts have the potential to impact residents more directly, because those would happen closer to where their homes are. We wanted to ask additional questions for each one of those alternatives. So for buyouts, we asked a question about if we were to select this alternative, what criteria should we use for offering or making residents eligible? The majority of residents said that only those that have experienced flooding should be offered a buyout, and it was followed by those in the 25-year floodplain, and then those in the 100 years. So what we learned from this is that residents are more likely to support offering buyouts to those that are at the highest risk of flooding or that have already experienced it in the past. Then another question related to buyouts. We asked if you were offered a buyout, and fair market value, would you consider selling your property? And we see that there's a lot of residents that are not sure, which is understandable because we haven't really had a chance to explain what the process would be. But we also see some support and some opposition. So these are just good things for us to know, just to understand how the community views the different alternatives. Then the last two questions of the survey were related to the creek modification. So we asked a question about, is it acceptable to remove large trees in order to reduce the risk of flooding? Again, we get a mix of responses. So overwhelmingly, people don't want to have trees removed, or if they are, maybe just a limited number. So 39% said no, 41% said only a limited number, and only 20% said yes. Then we asked a question about, is it acceptable to alter the look and feel of the creek? And again, yes and no are pretty even, and we have around a 20% rate of respondents saying that they're not sure. What we get from this is that residents value the creek, value the environment, and want to make sure that if this alternative or any other alternative is selected, that the environmental impacts are reduced as much as possible. So that's a summary of what we've heard so far from the survey. Just want to go briefly over what the next steps would be. So we want to incorporate everything that we've learned from the community into the report so we can finalize the feasibility report. Again, please remember that this feasibility report started with us evaluating 9 different alternatives and kind of honing into 3 of those. So we're wrapping up that this spring, and then we're hoping to start the next phase, which is the preliminary engineering phase in the fall. And that's going to be a much more detailed analysis of these 3 alternatives to get a better idea, or not better idea, but to know exactly what we'll be proposing as far as the extent of the creek modifications, for example, or the size of the tunnel, the locations, the inlets and the outlets. So a lot more detail, a lot more environmental investigations. We will update our estimates for schedules and for costs. Once that's done, if applicable, we would select an alternative, and that would likely happen in 2024. So we won't really have a lot of more details until after we've done all the hard work in the preliminary engineering phase, which, like I said, it's likely to take more than a year because of the complexity. Once that's done, if an alternative is recommended to move forward, then we would at that time determine what the potential funding sources would be. And then, as applicable, we will move forward with either design or implementation of the alternative. That's it for my presentation. So I guess we're going to the question and answer section.
So one question was, what is the address of the discharge location for the tunnel option east of Congress? And David, I didn't know if you wanted to speak to that and what happens in the next phase.
But I don't know that I have a specific address. It's like I said, it's very preliminary, but generally, I mean, it's located east of Congress and north of Stasny. The specific exact location I wouldn't know, but it's basically at this point that's what is proposed. It would be something that would be refined to know exactly where it would be in the next phase. But generally, it's north of Stasny and east of Congress.
I have another one. So for the tunnel option, would there be vibrations and noise throughout the neighborhood for 7 years during boring? What about the truck routes to remove the material from the tunnel?
It'd be a very deep tunnel, so it'd be to 50 feet underneath underneath ground level. That's certainly something that we will look at in detail in the preliminary phase to know what the impacts would be, and also we don't have details yet as far as what the routes would be for any material hollow. But that's all of those considerations would be obviously thoroughly vetted in the next phases of the study. But at this point, it's very, like I said, this is a feasibility, so it's very high level at this point. We don't have a lot of details yet.
How close are the businesses or homes near the tunnel discharge location?
I don't have the specifics about that yet, but the only thing is that any proposed discharge location would be chosen to make sure that there's no impacts to downstream residents. But certainly in the next phase of the study, we'll have a lot more detail about those type of considerations. At this point, it's like I said, it's a feasibility level. The only approximation that the engineers did was to make sure that there's no flooding impact downstream of the whatever it is discharging.
And I guess we'll go to Anna Pitala, who has her hand raised. Would you please unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question?
So I am interested in hearing some more information about the potential flooding east of Congress, because my main concern is right now the riparian areas and the creeks slow down the flow of water before it gets east of Congress. And so my concern is that there's going to be a wall of water through the tunnel that rushes out east of Congress and creates flooding. How do y'all test for that to see what that how that's going to impact the folks that are east of Congress?
For any improvement that we do, we're not allowed to cause any downstream impact. So this is all modeled to make sure that whichever location and configuration of the discharge location is selected, that it would not cause adverse impact. So that's the reason, for example, that we couldn't do the flood walls, because there was really no way for us to mitigate those impacts downstream. So it's a complicated process, but basically, because of the location of the outflow and in relation to some of the tributaries, the timing of when the water would reach that location works so that the peaks, basically what you want to avoid is that the peaks of that particular, for example, the bypass tunnel and some of the other tributaries, like you don't want everything to peak at the same time, otherwise you're going to have more flooding. So basically the way that this is assessed is through hydraulic modeling. So that's something that was done for this phase of the study. Our consultants did that, and obviously as these alternatives further study, that's going to continue to be assessed. But yeah, that's definitely one of the main considerations. We wouldn't be able to do this project if we're not able to show that it's not going to cause adverse impact downstream.
Regarding the study floodplain shown in the beginning of the presentation, what frequency is the event modeled for? Additionally, a map was revised indicating homes on Thistlewood and Heartwood Drive that would be in those floodplains. Can you share that during this meeting?
I'm assuming you're referring to this map. So this is the 100 years. So the outline in red, that's the current FEMA floodplain. And then the shaded area in blue, that's the water study saying that the 100-year floodplain actually is using the new National Weather Service data for Atlas 14. So both of those are 100-year, just the larger one is using the latest data. In the Heartwood area, we also use, or consultants use, more detailed modeling techniques. And what this is showing is that at very high, at significant rainfall events, some of that water from the event before around the First Street area would actually exit the creek and flow through some of those streets in the Heartwood area. So that's why some of those homes are shown in this floodplain map or this flood risk map that we developed for the project.
Okay, and I am being told that we're being asked if the city has a preference on which of these alternatives.
No, I think we have an open mind. I mean, we started with everything basically that we could think of that's typically used for this type of situations. We just recognize that it's a challenging area. It's a challenging project. We want to be able to provide the best service that we can, while at the same time using funds in the most efficient way. So, and also reducing environmental impact. So there's a lot of things that are in place. So from our perspective, whatever is shown to provide the best mix of those three things and is supported by the community, that's what we want to do. But it's challenging.
Okay, and I see Sarah Dunn has her hand up. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, I was just wondering what if the city has any tunneling experience on this scale around. What is our experience in Austin with tunneling like this?
So it's different. So the Waller Creek tunnel comes to mind. Size, the size of the diameter is similar. The way that this tunnel will work is actually a little bit simpler than that one, because that one, it's always filled with water, while this one is more of a passive tunnel that would just take water when it reaches a certain level. But yeah, certainly the Waller Creek tunnel comes to mind. There's obviously other projects related to Austin Water, but that's different type of projects, but also require tunneling.
You said exactly what I was going to say, David, is that Austin Water, which is our drinking water and wastewater utility, they have the most extensive network of tunnels in town. I don't know that they have one this large, but they have, I will say, a dozen tunnels kind of approaching this and using similar technology that we would be drawing on.
And that's Mike Kelly, everyone. He is our assistant director.
For any of the capital investments, there would probably be further maintenance required. Did this initial feasibility study look at long-term ongoing maintenance costs or just the initial infrastructure changes?
So we are considering as part of quantitatively that they were analyzed and kind of compared to one another to see which one of them would require the most maintenance, but that's not in the cost estimates that I provided. That's not part of the equation, but that's something that as we refine the designs more or the configurations more, we would also be able to be in a better position to get a better handle on what those needs would be.
The tunnel is to run under Stasny Lane from Westgate to South Congress. How will you get the water uphill east of the Union Pacific Railroad tracks?
So basically water would enter at that's right here where that orange circle is, there would be an inlet pond. So once water in the creek raises to that elevation, water would enter that pond and then into the bypass tunnel. And then it would flow east all the way down to east of Congress Avenue. And then there'll be a weir that would discharge it into the creek.
And another way to address it is that the tunnel would all be going downhill. So because it's so far underground, we're not constrained by the surface topography, and we would just bore the whole thing at a slant like this. And the ground elevation from Westgate is higher from that where it would be discharging. So the inlet would be higher than the outlet, and pressure would just drive the whole thing downhill.
Are federal funds being considered for the proposed project, perhaps HUD or FEMA? If so, concerning floodplain management and compliance with Executive Order 11988, it requires the project proponent to use FEMA flood insurance rate maps to determine if a property is located in a special flood hazard area. Can the city utilize the data from Atlas 14 if federal funds are used?
At this stage, because of the cost of all of these, we're going to be looking at every single funding option available. We wouldn't be able to handle it with our existing funding sources, which is the Drainage Utility Fund, because of the scale of this. So we would certainly be looking for federal funds. For any federal application, you've got to have a more well-developed alternative than we have right now. So I can't answer the specific questions right now until we've got an alternative. And then we would go to the various grants and look at the conditions and begin to see how we would satisfy the conditions for those grants. So once we get the next round of design iteration, we'll be able to have more information for y'all on what kind of funding sources may be available to us.
In the flyer distributed, alternative 3, the tunnel indicates that structures would no longer be at risk of flooding if that solution was implemented. Was this also evaluated for alternative 2, the creek modifications? Can you share this information?
For the tunnel, most or a good number of the properties would no longer be at risk. There would still be some that would be at risk, but very few and much lower risk. For the tunnel, we did look at the possibility of having a configuration which would kind of be comparable to the other alternatives, such as the buyout or the tunnel. However, it will require something, a scope that we just know it's something that we couldn't do just because of the environmental impacts that would take. So we did look at that possibility, but it's something that's just not feasible of the impact that it would have.
Would the tunnel interfere with future utility infrastructure that might need to run under Stasny, or would it be deep enough to not cause issues with any future fiber, telecom, electrical, etc.?
With the depths that we're looking at, it shouldn't have any impact with any existing or or proposed utilities.
In the bypass tunnel diagram, you all show which structures in particular would then no longer be at risk, but that information is not provided necessarily for the impact and where that impact would be for the creek modifications. Is that information for the creek modifications and which structures and where they are that would then no longer be at risk available?
It is not at this point. It will be in the next phase. Like I mentioned, we tackled the channel modifications slightly differently than we did the other alternatives. We first tried to, as I mentioned, we tried to come up with a configuration that would reduce risk to all properties, like have a basically 100-year flood event completely removed for all properties. And then the other thing that we did was analysis of a smaller, realistic channel modifications. However, at this point, it doesn't yet have the full, we don't yet have the full information on which specific properties would be benefiting. And like I said, it's very likely that those hatch lines, and I'm referring to these areas here, those hatch areas may change in the next phase. So it just the level of details that we have at this point for this alternative don't really allow us to share that level of information yet. But that's something that we would be able to do in the next phase of the study.
Okay, might be too early to tell, but are there estimated total lifespans for each of the options? If we go with buyouts now, would we maybe need the tunnel anyway in 10 years?
If buyouts were implemented, those homes that are made eligible and that choose to participate, obviously their flood risk is reduced completely. Obviously, those homeowners that are not eligible and or choose not to participate, and if they were at risk, the risk will remain. But obviously, it doesn't really. I guess for that particular instance, the tunnel would be kind of like a separate thing. I guess the question would be if we build the tunnel or the creek modifications, will we still need another alternative in the future? And our expectation would be that whatever alternative we choose to implement, we would be maintaining it so that it can keep its intended function. At this point, I don't have, if you're asking about specific number of years of lifespan for the alternative, that's something that will also be looked at into more detail in the next phase of the study.
I guess the concern that I have is that, if we, depending on whatever option we pick, anything that we're not doing and we find out later that we need to do it, that's just years that we didn't have the actual necessary thing. So, I get that it's early, so that's okay. It's just, that'd be the concern that I would have is that, if we do need a tunnel, but we don't do it now, then there's, 10 extra years of additional risk or whatever that we're not kind of looking at.
It's very hard to predict the future in that way because we are seeing increasing rainfall rates, but we don't have models to tell us how that will change in the future.
I have a follow-up question in the chat related to Mike's comment that another phase of plans needs to be done before funding can be applied for, identifying preferred alternatives. The question will more detail be pursued for all of the options?
More detail will be pursued for the 3 options that are still considered technically feasible, which is the channel modifications, the tunnel, and the buyouts. So each one of those would be a lot more data would be gathered and fine-tuning as to what exactly would be proposed for each of those alternatives.
If there are any more questions, please feel free to ask them. We are really grateful to everyone for coming out tonight and, spending some time with us on the Tuesday night to go over this. I know this is a big impact to your properties. David, is there anything else you wanted to say?
If you have any additional questions, feel free to reach us. Our information is in the pamphlets and everything that you receive, but you can also, that email address, middlewilliamson@syntexas.gov. If you email us, we'll get back to you with any specific questions that you may have. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.
Yeah. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us for more questions. It may be a little time before you hear back from us because as we, work on the preliminary engineering, a lot of that work is going to occur in our offices behind the scenes. So there may be a pretty good lull in time before you hear again from us, but we will be working away at this project. Thank you, everyone.